Today we're going to find out how to find imaginary solutions. The first thing that we have to remember is the quadratic formula. So we know the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And we know we can use this formula to find solutions for quadratics. So that's how we're going to go ahead and start these first examples. If we have something like this that asks us what are the solutions to 2x squared minus 3x plus 5 equals 0, you might try to factor it, you might try to graph it, but then you realize none of those options really work. So let's try the quadratic formula. We first know that a is 2, b is negative 3, and our c is 5. So let's try to plug that into the quadratic formula. So our solutions will be x equals negative b, which gives us a positive 3, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 3 squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2a, which will give us 4. Now we're going to try to simplify, so we get x equals 3 plus or minus the square root of 9 minus, and then if we do 4 times 2 times 5, we'll get 8 times 5, which is 40, all over 4. So far we're solving this the same exact way that we normally solve equations. Now I'm going to try to simplify. So I'm going to say x equals 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 31 over 4. Notice here that under the square root we have a negative number. That negative 31 I can change into negative 1 times 31. So this becomes 3 plus or minus I square root of 31 all over 4, or we can rewrite this as one answer, which we could write as 3 over 4 plus or minus I square root of 31 over 4. So there's just that last step of changing your negative square root into an imaginary number. Let's try another example. What are the solutions to 3x squared minus x plus 2 equals 0? First, we're going to identify a, b, and c. So we know a is 3, b is negative 1. If there's nothing in front of this x, we can know it's a negative 1. And c is 2. Let's plug into the formula and see what we get. X equals negative b, which is 1, plus or minus square root b squared, so that'll give us a negative 1 squared, minus 4 times 3 times 2, all over 2a, which is 6. Now we're going to try to simplify, so we'll write x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of whatever that number is all over 6. Right here, if you want to take what's in the square root and plug it right into your calculator with parentheses like that, you can go ahead and do that. If you do, you're going to get a negative 23. My last step is to rewrite that square root of negative 23 as an imaginary number. So I'm going to rewrite this as x equals 1 plus or minus I square root of 23 all over 6. Or our solutions are 1/6 plus or minus I square root of 23 over 6. Now that we've done two examples, you might want to pause the video and try this one on your own and check your solutions when you're done. So we'll get a is 1, b is negative 4, and c is 5. Now we're going to plug into our quadratic formula. Negative b will give us a positive 4 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2a. 2 times 1 will just be 2. So now we'll get x is equal to 4 plus or minus. If you plug in what's under the square root into your calculator, you're going to find out it's a negative 4 all over 2. In this example, square root of negative 4, well, I know the square root of 4 is 2, so I can rewrite this as x is equal to 4 plus or minus 2i all over 2. Lastly, I'll divide it up into two fractions. 4 divided by 2 gives me a 2, plus or minus 2 divided by 2 gives me a 1, so 1i, or just I. lastly, you might see something like this. If you recall, when we were trying to factor, if you found something like x squared minus 25, that was the difference of perfect squares. So you'd get x minus 5 times x plus 5. Notice now we have a plus sign right there. So what we have right now is called the sum of squares. And you might try and guess what you could factor. You might try x plus 5 times x plus 5. Doesn't work because if you do x plus 5 times x plus 5, we have to FOIL and we end up with x squared plus 10x plus 25. So this actually isn't going to work for us. Instead, if we have x squared plus 25 equals 0, what we can do is say this is x plus 5i times x minus 5i equals 0. So what we end up with is x equals negative 5i or x equals positive 5i. And there's our two solutions. We can try this same thing in this next example for what are the solutions to 4x squared plus 100. We'll notice right now 4 is a perfect square and 100 is a perfect square, and this is a sum, so we have sum of squares. When this happens, we'll first find what multiplies to 4x squared. Well, that'll be a 2x and a 2x. What multiplies to 100? That's a 10 and a 10. And now we'll do plus and minus with our i's on the end. If you end up factoring this, FOILing this out, you end up with the same result, 4x squared plus 100. So now we're going to set this equal to 0. We'll say 2x plus 10i equals 0, and 2x minus 10i equals 0. Now solve for x. 2x equals negative 10i, which means x is negative 5i. Or 2x equals 10i, so x equals positive 5i. And there we have our solutions.